Hello and welcome to another in the video series of CultureShock. I'm Rebecca Lewis-Smith and I'm very grateful today to be able to welcome Helen Fitzhugh, who's an academic at UEA, to join me in a conversation about organisational culture. Hi Helen.
Hi, thank you for inviting me.
Well, thank you so much for being here. Would you tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do?
Yes, so I'm a social researcher at the University of East Anglia in Norwich Business School, and I'm currently working with the Workplace Wellbeing Research team as both a researcher and also as something called a Knowledge Exchange Fellow, which means that I try and take the really useful evidence from our research and get it out to people. So that's one of the reasons I'm speaking with you today, but also why I'm working on a large project to write blogs, infographics, do podcasts, and make sure that all these useful findings on workplace wellbeing get out to businesses and organisations.
Oh, well, I'm so excited to be able to talk to you about this because a lot of the conversations that I have about organisational culture or company culture are around either with other business leaders or they're with people who, like coaches or people who specifically support leaders in various ways, but they're not necessarily academics and people with access to more research and to more information on a wider scale. So I often have that conversation with business owners who run businesses similar to mine, and that conversation is, hey, isn't it great that we can try out initiatives in our businesses? And then I have conversations with business leaders who are running much larger organisations who can pretty much say, yeah, well, that's all well and good for Fountain where there's 40 of you, but it's a lot harder in a much bigger organisation. But I love the idea of being able to just have a chat about a topic that I'm really passionate about with someone who is studying it on a different scale. That's really interesting.
I'm looking forward to it too, because I always like talking about making organisations better for human beings. That's what I'm passionate about. So
brilliant. So would you tell me about the project that you're currently working on, because I think you've got something incredibly relevant to this moment in time.
Yeah, so part of my work is on what's called the Purge Hub. That's a new initiative. It's been funded by the Economic and Social Research Council, and it's about productivity in the workplace. Now, it was obviously set up before the coronavirus hit, and we were planning all sorts of face-to-face masterclasses and practice workshops. But what's happened now is what we're going to do is take the findings from research carried out by 7 different universities in the UK, all of whom have specialism in some kind of productivity topic relating to people. So UEA has the workplace wellbeing specialism, but other ones have engaging employees, conflict management, management capacity, small business specialisms. We're, as part of this hub, we're going to all come together, pool our findings and try and find ways to get them out to organisations and businesses. So we haven't quite launched our website yet, but when we do, it will be mid-June, and we're going to have some launch week webinars introducing people to the idea of productivity through really valuing the people in your organisation. And I'm really looking forward to the launch. I think it's going to be great to start getting the findings out from all these different specialisms across the UK. And what we're going to do is we also want to have feedback from people out in businesses and organisations. So as well as trying to say this is what we've got so far, we want to hear from other people. And if anyone listens to this and thinks, oh, we would love to hear about workplace wellbeing in this context or that context, please do get in touch, because that's what I'm here for. I'm really open to speaking to people and making sure this is a two-way exchange, knowledge exchange fellow, not just a knowledge tell person.
I love that. It sounds really, really interesting, and I'm definitely going to be sort of seeking it out myself as you launch. I'll also be making sure that the links to it are available when this video goes live.
And I should also say we're going to try and tailor some of the previous findings to the current COVID-19 situation. So for instance, some colleagues of mine, Kevin Daniels and Rachel Nyani, had previously done work on distributed workers who are working away from their managers a lot of the time, not in their direct site, not in their place. And we took the knowledge from that pre-COVID research and translated it into a blog about, if you're managing for the first time people who are remote working, what do you need to think about, what do you need to do? So it's really robust, good research, and we're trying to make it really relevant for the kind of challenges that people will be facing at the moment.
Okay, so I have a question.
Yeah.
I'm managing people remotely for the first
Yeah.
time. What should I do?
Well, it's actually really a great opportunity to think about what a manager does, because often we go on and our lives are so busy, there's so many pressing demands that we don't have time to reflect on what a manager does for the people who they're supporting. And so what the kind of gist of my blog post about this was that we can take a moment and say, okay, well, what does a manager do? Well, obviously you provide direction, clear communication over what needs to happen. And if you can't do that in person, then it needs to happen over some kind of video conferencing, and how can that best happen? But there's so many other things. There's also, an awareness of that person's personal situation, and whether they need signposting to further support, whether they need, the physical setup to do their work. Do they need another chair? Do they need a bigger screen if they're going to be working for months away from you in their own home? There's also things which are much longer term. So if we are not just in lockdown for 2-3 weeks, but much longer, are we also thinking about how we do personal development, proper feedback and appraisal? Those are going to have to adapt to the current situation. And having to think about them now means that hopefully when we all get back in, offices, or we get back into a hybrid working situation where we're sometimes in an office and sometimes not, all of that thinking and all of that reflection will make people better managers going forward. I mean, that's my hope, and that's what I would like to contribute to.
Brilliant. It's interesting. My experience of that, when we first went into lockdown, we immediately did a work from home setup survey, just to make sure that everyone had what they needed. And it was really interesting, because we were having those conversations about, do you have a chair? Do you have a screen? And which also meant that you were facing people saying, yeah, but this will only be for a couple of weeks. And you sort of, it's probably going to be a bit longer. So having some other conversations. And as you say, I think that someone said to me, and it became really fundamental to how I was looking at it, that the initial moments of this, we had to go further down Maslow's hierarchy of needs. We had to make sure that people had the physical setup, that they were safe, that they had, that people were going to help them get food if they needed it, if they were sheltering, that kind of thing. Like suddenly, and as a business leader, you're not necessarily used to having to think of things on that level, because you probably ticked that off ages ago somehow. Yeah. And then you're, as you say, getting to that point of saying, okay, actually, when lockdown happened for us at Fountain, we do a lot of appraisals, and we have a great system that we've worked hard on, and it's now a really lovely, we do it 3 times a year. It involves 360 feedback from colleagues, and it's working really well. Lockdown happened in the middle of our appraisals, and so at the moment I'm in the middle of working on how we're going to be doing our appraisals in a remote situation, because as we say, we sort of got through the recovery moments, and now we are thinking about, okay, how can we make sure that people are developing, that we're not just in crisis mode still, but moving further up that Maslow's pyramid. Yeah, absolutely. And I think we also another piece of work that I did recently with my colleague Kevin again was about isolated and confined working and the risks of that. Relevant. Yeah, what we thought was there are professions where people do this as a matter of course. Actually, if you think about Highland farmers, or nurses in the outback of Australia, or astronauts perhaps is the extreme example, but there are people in the Antarctic who go away for 6-8 months
and are with a very small group of people and doing their work in an isolated and confined condition. And we thought, how much evidence is there out there about this, and can we learn from it for the current situation? There was good evidence. So what we did was a rapid review of reviews, which is basically other people have brought together lots of articles on one topic as a review, and then we looked at a lot of those reviews together and tried to bring out the themes in them. And you know, the news isn't necessarily particularly good about isolated and confined working. There are real risks around, you know, the sort of, yes, the tiredness and boredom end of the scale, but also of people feeling less motivated, not be able to think clearly under conditions of stress. And then, you know, up the sort of other end, we've got the likelihood of potentially drinking more, or, you know, insomnia, all of those things that we know can really affect people, their well-being and their performance. So I think what we were hoping to do is kind of raise awareness of that through doing this review of reviews, but also then say, okay, are there any mitigations for this, and can we get awareness of those out too, so that we can start helping people now with using the research from the past in different situations, but applying it to relevant current situations. And yeah, luckily there are some mitigations.
Great. The work that you've done there, is that published somewhere, that review of reviews?
Yeah, so at the moment we're just waiting for it to be published. So I keep saying to you, lots of things are on the horizon, but yeah, so we're just waiting for it to be published. Initially we will put out a blog, which is a plain English summary. We're hoping for a journal article to then follow. But also I'm looking into ways of presenting that in a friendly manner that we can get around social media, and I'm working on that currently, but the blog will be the first thing to go out.
And in terms of those mitigations for the dangers of isolated or remote working, can you share with us a few of those mitigation techniques?
Yeah, sneak preview, definitely. So there's things that sound obvious, but then we can give you a bit of nuance about them. So the first thing obviously is the potential for severe isolation. And the risk of that are all those things I've said. So, you know, around tiredness and lack of motivation and those kind of things. So what you need is to arrange for ways of having like high quality, regular social contact. And that's not just between workers and their managers, which is obviously useful and necessary, but also between workers and their co-workers, so that your team cohesion doesn't suffer in that way. And also workers and people who they might have met if they went out networking in some other way. You know, it's our professional lives are also marked by learning from others outside of our organisations and opening up our minds to training, new things. So when we're talking about contact, it's not just that immediate, oh yes, we've set up video conferencing, that's fine. It's also thinking about the ways in which we contact all those people who we would otherwise have not had contact with. So for instance, healthcare workers in rural Australia were not feeling backed up in difficult situations. So if they had a stressful situation, then they didn't know who to turn to debrief, that kind of thing. So that's a really important point. If someone's had a stressful situation at work, is there anyone they can turn to, and do they know how to do it? But also ongoing professional development for them was the same. You know, it was kind of like, if all the training courses are in the city and I have to be away for a week to go to the city and I can't do it, I don't get the same ongoing professional development as others. So finding ways to do those things will be really important. It's not just, oh yes, we've had a video conference once a week, we're all fine.
It's interesting. And then we're currently reviewing what we do at Fountain with that, because when we first went into lockdown, we set up water cooler hangouts on Google Hangouts. So each day we would normally be sitting near each other, and then some of them were really busy, others didn't get used at all. Some of them, you know, there was a group of 6 people and one person always turned up to check that who was there, but no one else made it work. So we're currently reviewing how we can reinvigorate that, because it's also having, you know, we're recording this in the beginning of June. Lockdown has been in place for a while. So some of those initial, like, all, you know, there's novelty of things to start off with, isn't there? And
absolutely.
Everyone's doing it, and then it stops. And we also have various social things. So at the end of the week, we always have some of our guys will offer to put together a pub quiz type of thing, or we'll have a beer o'clock where everyone gets their wine and we're over Zoom or whatever. But again, it's making sure that isn't masking that things aren't happening.
Absolutely.
As well. Just having it isn't enough. It actually has to be acted upon as well.
And I think you've highlighted something there that is really great and really exciting for me, is this idea of we all need to carry on learning. So we can, you know, from our research, we can give principles and highlight details of things that people can do. But each organisation's context will then require them to take a bit of time, have a bit of learning, and also something I've been talking to people about is the pressure on managers to kind of know and tell. Often you feel like it's a crisis, I must take a grip of this, you know, I must know and tell. But actually, we know that some of the best communication involves really deep listening. So you have that thing where you say, okay, well, it's not working. Let's talk to you about why. Let's talk about, is it not necessary for you, or do you not see the reason of it? And have those honest discussions. And I think those really underpin our good responses to crises. So not just thinking you have to, right, here's what we're doing, actually going about the learning and the communication to build relationships. And those will make those relationships stronger for whatever comes next.
Yeah, brilliant. Well, it's so interesting, isn't it? I think both organisational culture and leadership are so hugely tested by this crisis. I read a wonderful article in the Harvard Business Review the other day about the psychological concept of holding, and that as a leader, rather than setting vision, it's that aspect of holding our teams and giving them a foundation of, even if the communication is, we don't really know what's happening, the reassurance that comes through the honest conversation, all of those things. And it really resonated with me as one of those aspects of, like, everyone is in this boat at the minute, that no one knows how to do this. We're all working it out, learning as we go along, and then adapting our forms of leadership and our organisational culture. I mean, you know, at Fountain, we are so proud of our culture, and we put so much energy into it. And suddenly the game has changed completely due to COVID. As you say, learning and not assuming that we've got anything right, I think has been really integral to it. Like going, okay, let's do this. Oh no, that was wrong. Let's do that.
Yeah, absolutely. And just learning from that feedback, definitely. It's one of those major things. And one of the things that I've seen as really interesting is that when we've been looking at the research on isolated and confined working, or on distributed workers, it is the same things as if you were in the office that are really important. You know, it's about that kind of the quality of the job, the quality of the management, the relationships you have with co-workers, and then also, you know, the specific ability to signpost if you're struggling, or to make people aware of potential risks, like, you know, musculoskeletal risks of having your laptop down on the table all the time, or, you know, those kind of things. Those are the kind of things you would want to be doing in any work situation. So we're not suddenly saying, oh, because of this work on isolated and confined working, we're recommending something else. It's just the medium that you use to do it that is different. And like I say, you know, that hopefully means that because we're having to think about the medium, the content suddenly becomes much more apparent, and people can say, okay, well, these are the things I need to be doing. And we've learned from it. That's,
Absolutely. I wanted to ask you about another part of your career, or the work that you've done, which was around supervision culture. It was, when we were prepping for this video, you mentioned that you had done quite a bit of work. Was it with police force?
Yes, so I was...
Tell me a bit about that, because I'm very interested.
So I was on a knowledge transfer partnership between the University of East Anglia and the College of Policing, and it was absolutely fascinating time because I kind of had, you know, one foot in the university camp and one in the very, very practical world of policing, and it was. I did a number of projects while I was there, but they were all focused on improving the well-being of employees in the police. So that's not just police officers. So you can think of police officers out doing their responses to things, you know, uniformed officers. There are massive employees in the police. So also civilian staff and people in really varied roles. So it's a massive task to think what could help the well-being of all of them. But one thing that we thought about was, you know, the importance of good managers to people's well-being and therefore to their performance, because we know that if you invest in workplace well-being, there are productivity and performance gains as well. So we're not only saying, okay, we want the police officers and staff to have good well-being. Obviously, that's important. But hopefully that would then have knock-on effects to how they serve the public. So you've got all sorts of layers of kind of effect there.
Which again, talk about timely things in the world.
Yeah.
That we're recording this while protests are going on around the world against the police.
Absolutely.
To support police forces to work well and for the communities that they serve as well, which hugely comes down to organisational culture as well.
Yeah, it really does. And I think that there are a lot of people really willing to look into that change in culture that's required. But it's also, you know, there's a weight of history there and a weight of hierarchy. So making those changes is you know, something that we're all going to have to look at and try and find ways to address.
Absolutely. And in terms of that hierarchy, because I imagine Fountain is set up to run without a hierarchical line management system. As we went through a phase of rapid growth, we decided to go non-traditional rather than traditional. And it means that I'm very, you know, as someone who's a passionate advocate for that structure at Fountain, I'm very aware of the challenges of hierarchy. And when talking about things like productivity and well-being, an organisation like the police, similar to some other places that are incredibly hierarchical, I would imagine that it's actually really hard to. I was gonna use the word infiltrate, but I don't mean that. I mean to plant ideas around doing things differently when there is such a traditional hierarchy in place.
Yeah, so I have to say there is an appetite. There is an appetite for change. You know, not in everyone, but I met some really inspiring people who were trying to address that. And I think that's why, you know, projects like the project I was involved in, but there's also a wider push towards the well-being of police officers and staff. That's happening because people have been campaigning for it and saying, you know, this will help us and it will help us serve our communities better.
And how, in terms of that, in the context of a very, very traditional form of supervision, what were the big changes that you were hoping to translate through into the police forces? What were the main things that were addressed by your work?
So there will be a set of guidelines coming out. I feel awful because I keep saying they will be. But so that's the College of Policing is working on that at the moment. So I can't go into huge detail on the guidelines and preempt them. But I just think one of the things that is common across supervision in the police and in other places that might have hierarchies is this idea of support and communication. So a supervisor being there not just as someone to direct, but actually as a resource for the workers. So if they are there and, you know, it's almost a mind shift, really. It's I'm here to support your work. I'm not here to, you know, to say, you are my tools, I must use you to go out and do things. So it's a kind of a mind shift. And that idea of supporting can seem quite woolly to people. It can seem soft, and like, you know, oh, we're in a crisis, we must be direct, we must get on with things. But it's the least woolly thing you can think about. And I can't emphasize this enough. Showing up to people and listening to them and hearing difficult things and still being there and still doing things that you need to do is one of the strongest things you can do. Yeah. That if you are someone who can take that and say, okay, well, these people have had these issues in the past, I'm going to look for ways of finding them training. I'm going to look for ways of helping them sort out their work-life balance. You know, I'm going to do that whilst keeping the productivity of my whole team up and being fair to everyone. That's an immensely hard job, and it's an immensely important thing to be doing. So I think it was about trying to implement that mind shift, that saying, you know, strength comes from communication, building relationships, and really being aware of those responsibilities to serve others in your management role.
Brilliant. Well, that's so interesting. The final thing that I wanted to touch on that you mentioned that some of your work has focused on is around translating values into action. And it's something that comes up a lot in any conversation that I have about company culture, because on a podcast that I do, we did an episode which we named the building blocks of culture, and it was about values and various journeys that that me and my co-host had on forming values and then translating them into action. And I think it is such a, like, I love that every company knows it should have values. I think that's brilliant. But then there's a next step that needs to happen, which is making sure that those values aren't just words scribbled on a wall somewhere.
Yeah.
Or, things that are put out on like external facing like proposals or reports or that kind of thing, but that are actually lived in organisations. And I'd love to hear a bit about your work of that step between creating the values and translating them into action.
Yeah, so you have to be aware here, you're asking me about my PhD work, so it's very hard to give a very short answer about this, but I will try. There's 100,000 words for you to read if you would like to on this topic. But yeah, like I said, I did my doctoral thesis on the idea of how organisations translate their beliefs about what is good into action for the people they're trying to serve. And it was about social enterprises. So those are businesses that trade explicitly for a social purpose. They've got it written into their articles that that's why they exist. And I went out to see a good few social enterprises, and I talked to the managers and the frontline workers and to the people they were trying to support, and then try to map whether the things they were saying at management came through all of those levels. And it was absolutely fascinating, because a lot of the time it did. You know, these are social enterprises, and they're the ones who volunteered for research, so they're pretty good. They were up to scrutiny. But what happened was sometimes they would say, we're doing this. Let's say they were trying to say they were creating independence and autonomy in people who perhaps were vulnerable in some way. And what we would find is that the people at the other end would say, no, what they're doing for us is creating security and safety. And you would think, oh, that's interesting. Why is there this mismatch in what's going on here? And actually, it was often, like you say, about what they needed to say to funders, or to get the money to do what they needed to do. But it was also about whether the people at the other end valued the same things as the managers. So what was most important to those vulnerable people was that someone had actually taken care and paid attention and given that human contact and the chance to live. And they weren't so interested in this abstract idea of independence at that moment. What was necessary was someone had paid attention and given them that support. So it wasn't that the organisation wasn't doing something good. They were, but it was perhaps a slightly different type of good than the good they were talking about. And I think that we're all a bit prone to doing that if we need to get, you know, funding or investment or whatever. But it's really good to be aware of, so that you're not constantly saying you're doing one thing but actually, you know, delivering another. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And the thing I was thinking about in the example that you've used around they're saying they're offering autonomy or delivering autonomy, and what they're actually delivering is security. Well, security is a step on the path to autonomy, right? You can't really have autonomy without security. So you can probably then frame it in a way of saying we're working towards autonomy and we're starting off with security. But if the communication is completely out of line of saying, you know, if the organisation is banging the autonomy drum and everyone is saying no security, then that's where suddenly it feels out of line with values. Whereas actually, if you're able to say, you know, we know that the people that we're serving, their immediate experience of this is security, that is a step on the route to, then you might be able to keep funders and people happy.
And that's great. So I think it's also about where in that kind of chain you pitch. So yes, security might be here, and then the independence is much further along that way, and it's just recognizing those things. And one of the things that I found really interesting was that there were lots of organizations which had a real commitment in their DNA of the organization to participation, to cooperation, and the idea that communities of people work better than people having to be on their own and working things out. But because of the kind of society we live in, which values, you know, the individual very highly. I mean, I'm hoping this is changing slightly during the coronavirus and everyone's recognizing we're interconnected, but you know, that actually some of those things were being lost on people as well. So the idea that they were trying to bring them into a community and have mutual support and care for each other was sometimes being missed for the individual benefits. And also funders didn't necessarily want to know about the community and the cooperation and all of those things. So I think it's really just important to recognise that people might not get what you're trying to say is good about the situation. There might have to be some learning again. There might have to be some, okay, well, we think it's fantastic when people come together and cooperate and support each other because this, and this, and what we're trying to do is help you do that. And be slightly more explicit about it, because sometimes it doesn't translate, even if it's kind of built into the ideas that you founded the organisation on.
Yeah, absolutely. So Helen, I think I said before we started recording that we could probably go on talking about this for hours. I really think we could. It's really fascinating to hear your point of view and to hear about your research. Thank you so much for joining me to record this video. And I hope that the launch of both Propel Hub and your blog posts and articles, that I hope it all goes really, really well. I will be keeping an eye out for it.
Thank you for inviting me, and it's been great to talk to you.
Lovely to have you. Thanks ever so much. Bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.